Dear friends, I'm Professor Filip Kovacevic, and this is the 23rd edition of the Russian newspaper's Monitor. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for supporting Newsbud and becoming a member of the Newsbud community. This is your source for independent news coverage, not influenced by corporate or government agenda. Please share our news products with people you know. Let's strengthen independent, people-oriented media. Now, let's take a look at the front page news stories in the major Russian newspapers. Today, we'll begin with the front page of Rossiyskaya Gazeta, the Russian government-owned newspaper, the edition for March 3rd, 2017. In the middle of the front page, on the right, there is an article with an enigmatic title, Expensive Russians. The subtitle explains that a recent report found that Russia has 132,000 millionaires. The article reports that the number of very rich people in the world actually increased during the last year. And the same was the case in Russia. More specifically, the number of very wealthy individuals, defined as those with net worth of more than $30 million, grew by 250, and their total wealth increased by $40 billion. According to the article, it appears that the current global instability works in their favor. As the nation states are breaking down and new conflicts are breaking out, they are getting richer and richer. In my opinion, this is far from accidental. As I see, one of the key causes of overall instability is precisely the reckless profit-making of those at the top. The article reports that it is quoting the statistical data from the recently released Global Wealth Report, which is put together by the international consulting company Knight Frank and their colleagues from New World Wealth. According to this report, the number of the richest people in the world, those worth more than $30 million, increased by 6,300 in 2016. And there are about 200,000 such individuals in the world. Their total wealth in 2016 grew by $680 billion and is now around $20 trillion. In Russia, there are 2,750 of these ultra-millionaires, and their wealth grew by 10% last year. More than half of them live in the Russian capital, Moscow. In terms of their number, Russia ranks the 12th in the world. However, if all Russian millionaires are counted together, not only those who have more than $30 million, then Russia ranks the 5th in the world, after the United States, the UK, India, and China. However, according to Sergei Gipsh, the leading partner at Knight Frank Consulting, which compiled the report, the problem is that the millionaires in Russia constitute only 0.1% of the population, but own 62% of the Russian wealth, whereas in the world in general, the millionaires own only about 30% of the wealth. This makes Russia one of the most inegalitarian countries in the world. Olga Yasko, who also works at Knight Frank, added that the most depressive finding was that there was almost no middle class in Russia. On the one hand, they were very rich, and on the other hand, very poor. The article comments that the biggest fears of the Russian millionaires at this time are the increase of the government regulations on the movement of capital and the increase in taxes. And it appears that the Russian state is planning to be assertive in both areas in the coming period. In fact, in my opinion, the reason that this article was placed on the front page of the Russian government-owned newspaper is to signal to the Russian public that the government was aware of the problem of economic and social inequality in the country, and that it would implement certain policies and measures, not mentioned as yet, to deal with it. This is very important because it appears that the campaign for the Russian presidential election to be held in March 2018 has already started. And the potential presidential candidates know well that the Russian society is just as sensitive to the issue of social and economic justice as to the issues of law and order. It is indeed along these lines that the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who already declared his candidacy for president, began his campaign. His political organization has just released a documentary film alleging the high-level corruption of the Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. In the film, Navalny presents evidence that, according to him, demonstrates that Medvedev secretly owns huge mansions, vineyards, yachts, and even a medieval castle in Tuscany in Italy. What is interesting to me is that Navalny directly attacked Medvedev, who, as I have written in several of my articles for Newsbud, and especially in the article, "Will Nikolai Patrushev be the new Prime Minister of Russia?", has already fallen into disfavor with the President Vladimir Putin. And so, although it may appear paradoxical to many, by wanting to bring about the end of Medvedev's political career, Navalny, the opposition leader, is actually doing the bidding of Putin. Of course, this will be never admitted by Putin or anybody else in his inner circle of the Siloviks, the veterans of intelligence and military services, to which Medvedev had never belonged. But the popular discontent against Medvedev will increase, and Putin will have a good reason to replace him, seemingly to placate the people angered by Medvedev's alleged corruption, but in reality, this will be something that he wanted to do all along. In addition, Navalny will no doubt be made to suffer the legal consequences of his daring attack on Medvedev, and his presidential campaign will be hobbled. Thus, with just one blow, just like in judo, Putin will have eliminated both of his rivals. Let's stay with Rossiyskaya Gazeta, the newspaper owned by the Russian government, and take a look at the front page for another edition, the edition for March 6, 2017. On the top of the front page, there is a photograph of Nikolai Patrushev, the secretary of the Russian Security Council, the ex-FSB chief, and a good old friend from the KGB days of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. In a recent article for Newsbud, I presented several reasons why I think Patrushev is likely to be the next Russian Prime Minister. As I mentioned before, my article is entitled, "Will Nikolai Patrushev be the new Prime Minister of Russia?" In fact, if you do a Google search and go to the Google search engine and type in Nikolai Patrushev, Prime Minister in Russia, out of 50,000 results, the link to my article will be the first one offered. It's even higher than Patrushev's own Wikipedia page, which means that it has had tens of thousands of readers so far. Now, this article in Rossiyskaya Gazeta uses as a title Patrushev's own words. The quantity of cyber attacks on the Russian state institutions increased almost 4 times. The article continues on page 2 of the newspaper. It reports that at a recent meeting, Nikolai Patrushev stated that in 2016 there were 52.5 million computer attacks on the Russian institutions and organizations, whereas there were only 14.4 million in 2015. He also stated that in the majority of the cases, the cyber defense mechanisms put in place had been inadequate and needed to be improved. Also, the personnel in charge of these mechanisms and programs needed to be better trained. Patrushev emphasized that the level of protection would no doubt be much higher by the end of the year, because by this time, in accordance with Putin's recent decree, all Russian government institutions will have to be required to log on to the Russian state segment of the internet. In my opinion, this statement exposes the fact that the internet is rapidly ceasing to be one global, borderless space, the ubiquitous World Wide Web, but instead different parts of it are being, so to speak, nationalized and placed under much more strict open surveillance by various national governments. At the same meeting, which took place in the city of Kurgan in the Urals federal district in Russia, Patrushev also addressed the question of drug trafficking. He stated that though the number of drug addicts in Russia has not changed much in the last 5 years, there were more and more young people using drugs. According to the data Patrushev presented, at this time in Russian prisons, there are 164,000 individuals convicted of crimes having to do with drugs, and they constitute about 25% of total Russian prison population. Patrushev concluded that it was clear that the Russian police and security agencies needed to do much more to combat this social evil. In my opinion, this article is important not so much because of its content, but because of its placement on the front page, together with a color photograph of Patrushev. In other words, this is a signal that the Russian government is sending to the Russian public about Patrushev's importance. Patrushev is being portrayed as a strong, determined leader and a Russian patriot, committing to working for Russia's prosperity and well-being in an even higher government position than he has right now. At the same time, the current Russian Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev, is nowhere to be seen in this edition of Rossiyskaya Gazeta. And that is hardly an accident. Now, let's go to the front page of Nezavisimaya Gazeta, the middle-of-the-road newspaper, the edition for March 3rd, 2017. On the bottom of the front page in the middle, there's an article with the title, Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, awaits the Russian army. The subtitle explains further that the upcoming Russia-Belarus military exercise has scared NATO. The article reports that notwithstanding recent economic disagreements between Russia and Belarus, military cooperation between the two countries is still at a very high level. This week, an exercise involving 1,000 Russian and Belarus paratroopers is taking place near the Russian city of Pskov, Other similar exercises are also being regularly scheduled in other parts of the country. According to the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, the biggest joint exercise will take place in September under the name of Zapad 2017, meaning the West 2017. The exercise will take place simultaneously in several places in both countries. The Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko recently stated that the exercise has an exclusively defensive character because, quote, it would be unthinkable for us to attack any country, end quote. The article reports that at this time, hundreds of NATO troops have poured into the Baltic states. For instance, 250 US soldiers from the 3rd US Armored Brigade, as well as the soldiers from the 10th Air Brigade, entered Latvia. They are all housed in the former Soviet air base in Adaji, not far from the capital Riga. In addition, the commander of the US troops in Europe, General Ben Hodges, recently visited Lithuania and stated that more US troops will be sent there in the coming period. At this time, there are about 100 US troops in Lithuania and also the same number in Estonia. According to the article, there are also US troops in Poland, and their number will increase in the coming months, but the majority of the new US troops will continue to be based in Germany. It is interesting that most of these troops come from the US Air Force and are especially well equipped to confront the tank and armored divisions of the opponent. But as the article points out, nobody is publicly saying who the opponent is. However, this is just an element of the traditional NATO hypocrisy, because it is quite clear to all involved that the enemy is Russia. The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has called on Russia and Belarus to make their September massive military exercise transparent and invite Western journalists and NATO observers. This has been the case in the past, and the Belarus Defense Minister Andrei Ravkov confirmed that it would be the same this time around. I'm sure, however, that the NATO observers will be treated strictly on the basis of reciprocity. If they do not open their own military exercises to the Russian and Belarusian officials, I doubt that they will be allowed to see anything important during the West 2017 exercise. There will be nothing to write home about, except, of course, that which Putin and Lukashenko allow them to see, which should be enough to convince them to report to their governments that the further militarization of Eastern Europe, let alone some kind of an anti-Russian provocation, is not in their state's national interests and could be extremely dangerous for the well-being of their own citizens. Considering that at this time, the Trump administration operates under a severe domestic obstruction, it is not surprising that it has had no time to deal with the continued NATO buildup in East Central Europe. In my opinion, however, it would be very beneficial for the future of world peace if Trump and Putin met in person sometime soon and established a personal communication channel so that any possible incidents between the NATO and Russian troops in the region, and I'm sure there will be some, could be resolved quickly without sparking up a more serious confrontation between the two nuclear powers. Let's stay with Nezavisimaya Gazeta and take a look at the front page for another edition, the edition for March 7, 2017. On the bottom of the front page, there is an article with the title, "The Sanctions Cannot Contain Pyongyang." The subtitle explains that the US is threatening to bomb the North Korean rocket launching site. The article reports that 4 rockets recently launched by North Korea created quite a lot of commotion across the world. South Korea called on the United States to speed up the placement of its anti-missile shield on the South Korean territory, while Japan took steps to acquire it as well. According to the article, some officials in the Trump administration are advising Trump to bomb the North Korean launching site and also return the US nuclear missiles to South Korea. The article emphasizes that Russia and China are demanding restraint, not only from North Korea, but also from South Korea and the United States. According to the article, it is not likely that the rockets launched by North Korea were intercontinental missiles, even though the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un claimed in January 2017 that his regime was working on their construction. Even before he became president, Donald Trump stated that he would prevent the North Koreans from developing this kind of weapon. The article reports that last year North Korea accelerated work on both the rocket and nuclear weapons development. It has launched 25 rockets last year and carried out 2 nuclear tests. However, this time around, the North Koreans claim that they launched the 4 rockets as a response, as a reaction to the massive military exercises that the US and South Korea are conducting at this time. The article quotes Dmitry Peskov, the Russian President Putin spokesman, as saying that Russia was concerned by the increase of instability on the Korean peninsula and that it was calling on all sides to exercise restraint. According to Konstantin Asmolov, a senior expert at the Far Eastern Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences, the responsibility for the rise of tensions should be attributed to both sides, the North Korean side, as well as the South Korean and the US side. Asmolov stated that the current exercises conducted by South Korea and the United States revolved around the scenario of a preventive strike on North Korea, and that it was therefore no wonder how North Korea would react. In fact, according to Asmolov, the North Koreans should not be faulted for the most recent escalation of tensions. Regarding the US proposal for amplifying the sanctions against North Korea, Asmolov said that this would be difficult to do because the enforcement of sanctions was primarily dependent on China. And at this point of time, especially if the US-Chinese relations took a downturn, China would enforce them even less than it did so far, which, according to Asmolov, was not a whole lot. He also stated that Russia was likely to take the same approach as China. According to the article, this may force the United States to use military force and perhaps bomb the North Korean launching site. Another option was to return the US nuclear weapons to South Korea, which were removed in 1991 when North and South signed a declaration on the nuclear-free Korean peninsula. In my opinion, the situation on the Korean peninsula will continue to deteriorate. In fact, this may be the first major foreign policy crisis of the Trump administration. Trump's stated positions on free trade and the return of the manufacturing jobs to the United States go directly against the economic philosophy of the Chinese government and put the long-term growth of the Chinese economy under a question mark. Therefore, the Chinese agents of influence within the North Korean government will likely continue using it as a nightmarish proxy to cause discomfort and many sleepless nights in the Trump White House. It could even be that they are hoping that the failure to handle properly the tensions with North Korea would precipitate the downfall of the Trump presidency. In my opinion, such a turn of events is not something that the Chinese government would be against, especially if we take into consideration how much it stands to lose if Trump's economic policies really come to life. As far as the Russian government is concerned, even if the Russian officials are saying that they are very concerned about the tensions on the Korean peninsula, they would in fact secretly celebrate some kind of the US military involvement in Asia, because in that case, the US NATO activities in East Central Europe would be greatly slowed down, if not completely ground to a halt. Lastly today, let's go to the front page of Pravda, the newspaper of the opposition Communist Party of Russia, the edition for March 7, 2017. In the middle of the front page, to the right, there is an article entitled, "To the Memory of the Great Leader." Right below the title, there is a photograph of the Russian Communist Party chief Gennady Zyuganov laying flowers at the tomb of Joseph Stalin next to the walls of the Kremlin. The article reports that the 64th anniversary of Stalin's death took place on March 5th, and to commemorate the occasion, hundreds of the Communist Party members and their sympathizers paid their respects and laid flowers at Stalin's tomb. According to the article, the communists were joined by the representatives of the Alliance of the Soviet Military Officers and the All-Russian Protest Movement. The article reports that Zyuganov gave an inspired speech about Stalin after laying flowers at the tomb. He chronicled Stalin's involvement in the preparation for the Bolshevik October Revolution, which actually took place in early November, that is, in late October, according to the old-style calendar, which was in use in Russia at that time. It took place exactly 100 years ago in October. Zyuganov also stated that under Stalin's leadership, the Soviet Union increased its economic output 70 times, and as a result of that, became one of the two world's superpowers. According to Zyuganov, all this was accomplished thanks to, quote, Stalin's talents, energy, and powerful political will, end quote. Zyuganov concluded that the Russian people needed to celebrate Stalin and not to confine him to the margins of their history. In my opinion, what we see here is one of many signs of historical revisionism regarding Stalin and his rule, which is taking place in Russia right now. Stalin is more and more portrayed and revered as a great political and military leader, and less remembered as the mastermind of brutal collectivization drives, merciless purges, and horrific labor camps. In fact, several contemporary Russian historians who are very influential in the Russian public life, such as, for instance, Andrei Fursov, Alexander Kolpakidi, and Nikolai Starikov, claim that most accounts of Stalin's rule have been falsified for reasons of political utility by his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, and his immediate circle after Stalin's death. According to them, these falsifications and fabrications were also presented as historical facts by the anti-Soviet Western historians who were not interested in objectivity and historical truth, but in imposing an antagonistic ideological and geopolitical agenda on the world. And so the image of Stalin as a tyrant entered the popular consciousness, whereas the archival documents about the period paint a very different picture. For instance, the revisionist Russian historians claim that the party and military conspiracies against Stalin were real, and that the purges were the only way Stalin could protect his political program and even the national security and territorial integrity of the Soviet Union. These historians also say that the number of the purge and labor camps victims was greatly exaggerated for the internal political as well as the external Cold War propaganda purposes by the West. They typically point to what they describe as the nefarious role that Alexander Solzhenitsyn and his books on the Gulag Archipelago played in this history-twisting effort. There is also an American historian who belongs to this Stalin revisionist camp. His name is Grover Furr, spelled F-U-R-R, and his best-known work is Khrushchev Lied, published in 2011. He also wrote about the secret political police chiefs Lavrenti Beria and Nikolai Yezhov, and the assassination of the Leningrad's Communist Party chief, Sergei Kirov. His books could be found on Amazon.com and on the internet. Dear friends, that's all for today. Thank you for watching. Please support Newsbud and be cool and stay cool until the next edition of the Russian newspaper's Monitor.
For just a small subscription fee, you can become a member of the Newsbud community and help keep this website running. Your subscription will provide you with full community access to exclusive content, including videos and articles from Newsbud's team of experts and analysts, as well as a members-only monthly newsletter from Newsbud's founder, Sibel Edmonds. Sign up today for full access at newsbud.com.